In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to take a sprite sheet animation and implement it in your Corona SDK project. Now, as you can see in my simulator here, I've got a sprite animation running. I took this sprite, I downloaded the bitmaps off of a website, which I'll put on this, I'll post the link on this video. Downloaded it from that website, built the sprite sheet in Sprite Helper Pro, and I implemented it in my Corona SDK project. So I'm going to show you that second part where we're implementing the actual sprite. I have other videos where I show you how to use Sprite Helper Pro, but for this, I'm assuming you know how to do that, you've done it already, and you've got your sprite sheet ready. So let's get started. Okay, so now I've got my Sprite tutorial project open, Corona SDK project, and in here, in this project folder, in addition to the main.lua file here, we have 3 additional files which are of interest to us in this particular project. The first one is this file barbarian.png, and this is the sprite sheet that we're going to use to generate our animations from. Now, as you can see, there are several frames to this sprite sheet, and it's probably hard to tell what these are exactly, but they're a barbarian character and 8 different animation sequences representing him walking in different directions. So he's walking north, south, east, west, as well as northeast, southeast, northwest, and southwest. So these 8 sequences can be chosen within our project anytime we want to. So the cool thing about Sprite Helper Pro is it also, in addition to generating this PNG file, the sprite sheet file, it generates a sequence file, that's this animations file right here, and a data file. Now let's have a look at the data file. This file contains a description essentially of the locations and the height and width of each frame contained in the sprite sheet. So if there are 64 frames, you're going to have 64 little table entries here for each of those frames, and that is really super handy because you don't have to define these by hand in your main.lua file. So that just gets you the sprite sheet data. Now the other important file it creates is this animations or sequences Lua file, and what this does is it generates or it creates the animations that you created within Sprite Helper Pro. So in this case, you can see I created 8 animations, 1 for each direction that the character walks. And you can see that it gets a name. It also has the frame numbers, which can be derived from this data file. And go back to that animations file. The time it takes for that to loop, that's 1 second. And loop count. Loop count is actually set to 0, which means it's going to loop infinitely, which is what you normally want, because you can use Corona SDK methods in there to start and stop your animations. So we've got these 3 files. The cool thing about these 2 files is that in my main.lua file, you can see, you can require those files and basically include them into your project and not have to type all that stuff into your main.lua file. So let's get started. So we're going to start off by defining our sprite sheet data file. So we're going to create a variable here called barbarian sheet data. And we're going to require barbarian data.lua. Now notice I don't need to put the extension there. You don't do that for require statements. And I'm just going to double check that. Yes, barbarian data is what we want there. Make sure you put that file name in quotes. And we're also going to require the sequence data. let's make sure that's correct. Let's take a look at our project folder. And barbarian animations is what we want. Okay, good. So now we've required these two files. I'm going to save it, make sure there are no errors. And no news is good news, so we'll move on. Now the next thing we need to do is we need to create a table, basically an options table for the sprite sheet. And those options are going to be derived from the barbarian sheet data variable that we created. So there's a function in there you're going to see that we're going to run that will load all of the sheet data into the sheet options variable. So I'm going to create the variable called sheet options, and we're going to equate it to barbarian sheet data. Oops, and I have to capitalize the sheet and data. So that's this file right here, and we're going to use a decimal here, and then we're going to separate that with a decimal. We're going to call a function called getSprite sheet data. So all we're doing is we're calling this function within this Lua file, and we're loading the results into this this variable, and it's basically creating a big table of sprite sheet data that we're going to need. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing for our sequences. And we're going to call this variable walking barbarian, and we're going to call this this Lua file, and we're going to call this function called getSequenceData. Okay. So again, it's going to call this function, which will load all the animations into this variable called walking barbarian. Let me save it, make sure I get no errors, and I don't, so that's great. So let's move on. I'm going to start now. We're going to begin defining the actual sprite sheet. So I'm going to call this sprite sheet barbarian sprite sheet, for lack of a better name. Of course, you can call it whatever you want. And let's see, we're going to use the graphics.newImageSheet method. And the arguments that we pass are the actual sprite sheet PNG file. So barbarian.png. And the second argument is going to be a table of options. Now, we've conveniently define those options right here. So I'm just going to copy that variable and paste it in and close that. And let's save it. And the next thing we need to do is define the actual sprite that this is displayed on the screen. And do that by defining a new variable. We're going to call this one barbarian walking. And we're going to equate that to a new method, display.newSprite. And what we're going to display is the barbarian sprite sheet. And that is this variable up here I created. And a second parameter is going to be the animations, walking barbarian, and that's this one right here. So it's going to get the sequences from there. Go ahead and save that, and no errors. Now notice up in the top here we have what looks like some sort of character up in the top corner. Let's go ahead and locate that guy at the middle of the screen. So we're going to set the X property to be the center of the screen, display.content center X, and walking.y, we're going to set the Y location to be display.content center Y. Because I'm anal, I'm going to put a space there, doesn't really matter. And now we've got our walking barbarian in the center of the screen. Now that walking barbarian isn't really walking yet, it's just standing there. So what we can do is start playing it. And to do that, we just refer to the sprite name and use the colon, and we're going to use the play method. And because this is a sprite type of object, the play method will work on this. So if we do that and save it, you can see now he's walking in, I guess it's southeast. Looks like it's a southeast sequence. So let's say I don't like the southeast sequence. I want it to play a different sequence. So we can do this, barbarian walking. And we're going to call another method set sequence. And then in parens and quotes, we're going to put in the sequence we want. Now the sequence we want is going to be derived from this animation's Lua file. And here are the names I'm talking about. Here's walking SE and walking NE, walking E. These are all the sequence names that we can call. Notice walking SE, that's his default. So if you don't specify a sequence, it's going to play the first sequence defined in that Lua file. So I'm going to override that sequence by having him walk west, walking W. And when I do that, now he's walking straight west. So that's essentially what you do to get your animation playing. Now, that's not terribly realistic at this point just because he's just sort of walking in place. So we could do cool things like apply a transition to the character. And have him say walk across the screen. And there he goes. And imagine you can even do things. You can set up a function, set up buttons, and just basically have him walk all over the screen, follow a maze, and that sort of thing. So that's how you implement a sprite sheet in Corona SDK, at least one that you've created in Sprite Helper Pro. There are other ways to do it. There are simple sprites or even more complex sprites, but I like that product, Sprite Helper Pro, because it does a lot of the heavy lifting for you. You don't have to mess with all that, and it makes my life a lot easier. So I hope you found this helpful, and be sure to check out my other tutorials.